Order, order. Order. Before I call the Chancellor of the Exchequer, I remind all honourable members that copies of the budget resolutions will be available to them in the vote office at the end of the Chancellor's speech. I also remind all honourable and right honourable members that it is the norm to not intervene on the Chancellor of the Exchequer or the Leader of the Opposition. I now call Mr Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Right Honourable George Osborne.
Mr Deputy Speaker, today I report on a Britain that is growing, creating jobs and paying its way. We took difficult decisions in the teeth of opposition and it worked. Britain is walking tall again. 5 years ago, our economy had suffered a collapse greater than almost any country. Today I can confirm, in the last year we have grown faster than any other major advanced economy in the world. 5 years ago, millions of people could not find work. Today I can report more people have jobs in Britain than ever before. 5 years ago, living standards were set back years by the Great Recession. Today, the latest projections show that living standards will be higher than when we came into office. 5 years ago, the deficit was out of control. Today, as a share of national income, it is down more than a half. 5 years ago, they were bailing out the banks. Today, I can tell the House, we're selling more bank shares and getting taxpayers' money back. We set out a plan. That plan is working, and Britain is walking tall again. And so the critical choice facing the country now is this. Do we return to the chaos of the past, or do we say to the British people, let's go on working through the plan that is delivering for you? Today, we make that critical choice. We choose the future. We choose, as the central judgment of this budget, to use whatever additional resources we have to get the deficit and the debt falling. No unfunded spending, no irresponsible extra borrowing. For no short-term giveaway can ever begin to help people as much as the long-term benefits of a recovering national economy. In the emergency budget I presented to this House 5 years ago, I said we would turn Britain around. And in this last budget of the Parliament, we will not waver from that task because we choose the future. Our goal is for Britain to become the most prosperous major economy in the world, with that prosperity widely shared. So we choose economic security. This budget commits us to the difficult decisions to eliminate our deficit and get our national debt share falling. We choose jobs. This budget does more to back business and make work pay, so we create full employment. We choose the whole nation. This budget makes new investments in manufacturing and science and the Northern Powerhouse for a truly national recovery. We choose responsibility. This budget takes further action to support savers and pensioners. We choose aspiration. This budget backs the self-employed, the small business owner and the home buyer. We choose families. This budget helps hard-working people keep more of the money they have earned. This is a budget that takes Britain one more big step on the road from austerity to prosperity. We have a plan that is working, and this budget works for you.
Order. Just 1 second. Just 1 second. I'm struggling to hear what the Chancellor of the Exchequer said, and I'm sure that all members in the House want to hear their Chancellor, but more importantly, so do our constituents. George Osborne.
Mr Deputy Speaker, the British economy is fundamentally stronger than it was 5 years ago. And that is reflected in the latest forecast from the Office for Budget Responsibility. It seems remarkable that until this government came to office, our national forecasts were manipulated by chancellors to be fiddled and fixed in pre-election budgets. Today, they are produced with independence and integrity by Robert Choate and his team, and I want to thank them for their work. The OBR confirmed today that at 2.6%, Britain grew faster than any other major advanced economy in the world last year. That is 50% faster than Germany, 3 times faster than the Eurozone, and 7 times faster than France. And there are some who advise us to abandon our plan and pursue the French approach. I prefer to follow the advice of the Secretary General of the OECD, which he gave to us all last month. He said, Britain has a long-term economic plan and it needs to stick with it. A long-term economic plan. Now there's someone with a way with words. And we need to stick with that plan at a time when global economic risks are rising. The biggest development since the autumn statement has been the further sharp fall in the world oil price. Now, this is positive news for the global economy, but the overall boost this provides has not yet offset the rising geopolitical uncertainty it causes, and the Eurozone continues to stagnate. So at this budget, the OBR have once again revised down the growth of the world economy, revised down the growth of world trade, and they've revised down the prospects for the Eurozone. And they warn us that the current standoff with Greece could be very damaging to the British economy. I agree with that assessment. A disorderly Greek exit from the euro remains the greatest threat to Europe's economic stability. It would be a serious mistake to underestimate its impact on the UK, and we urge our Eurozone colleagues to reserve this growing crisis. The problems in Europe remind us why Britain needs to expand our links with the faster growing parts of the world. We've made major progress in this Parliament. I can report that the trade deficit figures published last week are the best for 15 years. And we will do even more. So today I'm again increasing UKTI's resources to double the support for British exporters to China. We have also decided to become the first major Western nation to become a prospective founding member of the new Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, because we think you should be present at the creation of these new international institutions. Mr. Deputy Speaker, you would expect weaker world growth, weaker world trade, and weaker European growth to lead to weaker growth here in the UK. However, the OBR haven't revised down Britain's economic forecasts, they have revised them up. A year ago, they forecast growth in 2015 at 2.3%. In the autumn statement, that was revised up to 2.4%. Today, I can confirm GDP growth this year is forecast to be higher still at 2.5%. It is also revised up next year to 2.3%, and that is where it remains for the following 2 years before reaching 2.4% in 2019. So the OBR report growth revised up, and their numbers confirm that growth is broadly based. For we are replacing the disastrous economic model we inherited. Between 1997 and 2010, investment accounted for less than 1/5 of Britain's economic growth. 4/5 came from debt-fueled household consumption. Meanwhile, manufacturing halved as a share of our national economy, and the gap between the north and the south grew ever larger. I can report that since 2010, business investment has grown 4 times faster than household consumption. Britain's manufacturing output has grown more than 4.5 times faster than it did in the entire decade before the crisis. And over the last year, the north grew faster than the south. We are seeing a truly national recovery. Mr. Deputy Speaker, let me turn now to the rest of the forecasts. This morning we saw the latest job numbers. It's a massive moment. Britain has the highest rate of employment in its history, a record number of people in work, more women in work than ever before, and the claimant count rate is at its lowest rate since 1975. For years, governments have talked about full employment. This government is moving towards achieving it. Unemployment today has fallen by another 100,000, and compared to the autumn statement, the OBR now expect unemployment this year to be even lower. It is set to fall to 5.3%, down almost a whole 3 percentage points from the rate we inherited from the last government. When we set out our plan, the Leader of the Opposition predicted that 1 million jobs would be lost. Instead, over 1.9 million new jobs have been gained. Because our long-term plan is based on the premise that if you provide economic stability, if you reform welfare and make work pay, and if you back business, then you will create jobs too. And today's figures show that under this government, 1,000 more jobs have been created every single day. The evidence is plain to see. Britain is working again. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, what about all those who say the jobs aren't real jobs, they're all part-time, they're all in London? Nonsense. How many of the jobs are full-time? 80%. How many of the jobs are in skilled occupations? 80%. Where is the unemployment growing fastest? In the northwest of England. Where is a job being created every 10 minutes? In the Midlands. And which county has created more jobs than the whole of France? The great county of Yorkshire. We are getting the whole of Britain back to work with a truly national recovery. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is only by growing our economy, dealing with our debts and creating jobs that we can raise living standards. To the question of whether people are better off at the end of this Parliament than they were 5 years ago, we can now give the resounding answer, yes. You can measure it by GDP per capita, and the answer is yes, up by 5%. Or you can use the most up-to-date and comprehensive measure of living standards, which is real household disposable income per capita. In other words, how much money families have to spend after inflation and tax. This is the living standards measure used by the Office for National Statistics and by the OECD. And on that measure, I can confirm, on the latest OBR data today, living standards will be higher in 2015 than in 2010. And it confirms that they are set to grow strongly every year for the rest of the decade. The British people, for years, paid the heavy price of the Great Recession. Now the facts today show households on average will be around £900 better off in 2015 than they were in 2010, and immeasurably more secure for living in a country whose economy is not in crisis anymore, but is instead growing and creating jobs. Mr. Deputy Speaker, because we have strong growth and a strong economy, we can also afford real increases in the national minimum wage. This week, we accept the recommendations of the Low Pay Commission that the national minimum wage should rise to £6.70 this autumn, on course for a minimum wage that, as the Prime Minister just said, will be over £8 by the end of the decade. And we've agreed the biggest increase ever in the apprentice rate. It's the oldest rule of economic policy. It's the lowest paid who suffer most when the economy fails, and it's the lowest paid who benefit when you turn that economy around. Mr. Deputy Speaker, household incomes also go further because we now have the lowest inflation on record. The OBR today revised down their forecast for inflation this year to just 0.2% and revised it down for the following 3 years. It is driven by falling world oil and food prices, not the kind of stagnation we've seen on the continent. But we will remain vigilant. I am today confirming that the remit for the Monetary Policy Committee for the coming year remains the 2% symmetric CPI inflation target. And I'm also confirming the remit for our new Financial Policy Committee too, so that this time we spot the financial risks in advance. The fall in food prices is good for families, but it reminds us of the challenge our farmers face from volatile markets. The National Farmers Union have long argued they should be allowed to average their incomes for tax purposes over 5 years. I agree, and in this budget we will make that change. We will also use this opportunity to lock in the historically low interest rates for the long term. I can tell the House that we will increase the number of long-dated gilts that we will sell. We will also redeem the last remaining undated British government bonds in circulation. We'll have paid off the debts incurred in the South Sea Bubble, the First World War, the debt issued by Henry Pelham, George Goshen and William Gladstone. The debt issued by Gordon Brown will take a little longer to pay off. Mr. Deputy Speaker, since the
Order. We want to get through this budget. The sooner we get through, the better, and then we can debate it. Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, since the pound goes further these days, now is a good time to confirm the design of the new £1 coin based on the brilliant drawing submitted by 15-year-old David Pearce, a school pupil from Walsall. The new 12-sided pound coin will incorporate emblems from all 4 nations, for we are all part of one united kingdom. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I now turn to the national debt. Lower unemployment means less welfare. And compared to the autumn statement, welfare bills are set to be an average of £3 billion a year lower. Lower inflation means lower interest charges on government gilts. Those interest charges are now expected to be almost £35 billion lower than just a few months ago. Rising unemployment and compounding debt interest contributed to our national debt problem. But they weren't the only cause. The last government increased debt by £192 billion, bailing out the banks, and it sent the national debt rocketing up by a third. Now, we have already sold the branches of Northern Rock and raised £9 billion from Lloyds shares. Now we go further. Today I can announce that we are launching a sale of £13 billion of the mortgage assets we still hold from the bailouts of Northern Rock and of Bradford and Bingley. Lloyds Bank has returned to profit and is paying a dividend, so we can continue our exit from that bailout too. We will sell at least a further £9 billion of Lloyds shares in the coming year. The last government put taxpayers' money into the banks, and this government is getting it back. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the bank sales and the lower debt interest and the lower welfare bills presents us with a choice. We could treat it as a windfall, even though we know the public finances need further repair. And with an election looming, some of my immediate predecessors may have been tempted to do this, but that would be deeply irresponsible. We'd be spending money we didn't really have, racking up borrowing our country couldn't afford. We'd be repeating all the mistakes of the last government instead of fixing those mistakes. So today, the central judgment of this budget is this. We will use the resources from the bank sales and the lower interest payments and the lower welfare bills to pay down the national debt. We put economic security first. For higher national debt leaves our nation exposed, harms potential growth and costs taxpayers billions of pounds in debt interest. And that would be throwing away billions of pounds we should be using to fund our public services and lower taxes. 5 years ago, national debt was soaring. And that was why, in my first budget, I set a target that we would have the national debt falling as a share of GDP by 2015-16, the last year of this Parliament. And the Eurozone crisis made that task here at home all the more difficult. And for much of the last 5 years, it looked like we might fall short. The Leader of the Opposition confidently predicted we would fail. The Shadow Chancellor repeated that prediction last week. but I can announce this to the House. The hard work and sacrifice of the British people has paid off. The original debt target I set out in my first budget has been met. We will end this Parliament with Britain's national debt share falling. The sun is starting to shine and we are fixing the roof. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the OBR report today, the debt as a share of GDP falls from 80.4% in 2014-15 to 80.2% in the year 2015-16, and it keeps falling to 79.8% in 2016-17, then down to 77.8% the following year, to 74.8% in 2018-19, before it reaches 71.6% in 2019-20. Mr. Deputy Speaker, national debt as a share of our national income has been increasing every single year since 2001. Those 13 years amount to the longest year-on-year rise in our national debt since the end of the 17th century. Today, we bring that shameful record of irresponsibility to an end, and we make sure we pay down our national debt. And there's a consequence for our fiscal plans. Because the national debt share is falling a year earlier than forecast at the autumn statement, the squeeze on public spending ends a year earlier too. In the final year of this decade, 2019-20, public spending will grow in line with the growth of the economy. We can do that while still running a healthy surplus to bear down on our debt, a state neither smaller than we need nor bigger than we can afford. For those interested in the history of these things, that will mean state spending as a share of our national income the same size as Britain had in the year 2000. And that is the year before spending got out of control and the national debt started its inexorable rise. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, when we came to office, the deficit stood at more than 10% of our national income, one of the highest of any major advanced economies and the largest in our peacetime history. The IMF says we've achieved the largest, most sustained reduction in our structural deficit of any major economy. Today, the OBR confirmed that it now stands at less than half of the deficit we inherited. But at 5% this year, it is still far too high and it must come down. With our plan, it does. The deficit falls to 4% in 2015-16, then down to 2% the following year, and down again to 0.6% the year after that. The deficit is lower in every year than at the autumn statement. And in 2018-19, Britain will have a budget surplus of 0.2%, followed by a forecast surplus of 0.3% in 2019-20. We will also comfortably meet our fiscal mandate, and Britain will be running a surplus for the first time in 18 years. Mr. Deputy Speaker, that leads to borrowing. Every one of the borrowing numbers is lower than at the autumn statement. We inherited annual borrowing of over £150 billion from the last government. This year, borrowing is set to fall to £90.2 billion, a billion lower than expected at the autumn statement. It falls again in 2015-16 to £75.3 billion, then £39.4 billion the year after that, before falling to £12.8 billion. In total, that's £5 billion less borrowing than we forecast just 3 months ago. In 2018-19, we reached an overall surplus of £5.2 billion. That's a £1 billion improvement compared to December. And in 2019-20, we are forecast to run a surplus of £7 billion. So growth is up, unemployment is down, borrowing down in every year of the forecast. We reach a surplus, all contributing to a national debt now falling as a share of national income out of the red and into the black. Britain is back, paying its way in the world today. Mr. Deputy Speaker, lower borrowing and falling debt as a share of GDP will only continue with a credible plan to control public spending and welfare. As we end the Parliament, we can measure the scale of the achievement. The administrative costs of central government will be down by 40%. We have legislated for welfare savings of over £21 billion a year. And because savings have been driven by efficiency and reform, the quality of public services has not gone down, it has gone up. Satisfaction with the NHS is rising year on year. Crime is down 20%. 1 million more children attend good or outstanding schools. But the job of repairing our public finances is not done. And here's a very important point the country needs to understand. National debt as a share of GDP is now falling, and will only keep it falling if we commit to the fiscal path set out in this budget. If we deviate from this path, if we go slower or borrow more, the national debt share will not keep falling, it will start rising again. And after all the hard work of the British people over the last 5 years to reach this point, that reversal would be a tragedy. Britain is on the right track. We must not turn back. And in order to deliver that falling debt share, we need to achieve the £30 billion of further savings that are necessary by 2017-18. I'm clear exactly how that £30 billion can be achieved. £13 billion from government departments, £12 billion from welfare savings, £5 billion from tax avoidance, evasion and aggressive tax planning. We have done it in this Parliament. We can do it in the next. And the distributional analysis we published today confirms that the decisions across this Parliament mean the rich are making the biggest contribution to deficit reduction. This has been true at every fiscal event under this government. I said we would all be in this together, and here is the proof. Compared to 5 years ago, inequality is down, child poverty is down, youth unemployment.
Order. We've got to get to the end to hear what the Leader of the Opposition says. We won't do so if you keep trying to shout the Chancellor down. Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, they don't like to hear it, but inequality is down, child poverty is down, youth unemployment is down, pensioner poverty is at its lowest level ever, the gender pay gap has never been smaller, payday loans are capped and 0 hours contracts regulated. Even more than this, opportunity has increased. The number of university students from disadvantaged backgrounds is at a record high. Apprenticeships have doubled, and there are fewer workless households than ever before. And in this budget, we are providing funding for a major expansion of mental health services for children and those suffering from maternal mental illness. Those who suffer from these illnesses have been forgotten for too long. Not anymore, because we stand for opportunity for all. And we have created, Mr. Deputy Speaker, a fairer tax system. Further proof that we are all in this together. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the share of income tax paid by the top 1% of taxpayers is projected to rise from 25% in 2010 to over 27% this year. That is higher than any one of the 13 years of the last Labour government. We're getting more money from people paying the top rate of tax because we understand that if you back enterprise, you raise more revenue. And the House will also want to know this. The lower paid 50% of taxpayers now pay a smaller proportion of income tax than at any time under the previous government. I will not accept lessons in fairness from those who impoverished the entire country and left millions of people out of work. We are delivering a truly national recovery. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in this budget, everything we spend will be paid for, and this requires the following decisions. We have already taken steps to curb the size of the very largest pension pots, but the gross cost of tax relief has continued to rise through this Parliament, up almost £4 billion, and that is not sustainable. So from next year, we will further reduce the lifetime allowance from £1.25 million to £1 million. This will save around £600 million a year. Fewer than 4% of pension savers currently approaching retirement will be affected. However, I want to ensure that those still building up their pension pots are protected from inflation. So from 2018, we will index the lifetime allowance. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we've had representations that we should also restrict the annual allowance for pensions and use that money to cut tuition fees. I have examined this proposal. It involves penalising moderately paid, long-serving public servants, including police officers, teachers and nurses, and instead rewarding higher-paid graduates. So I agree with most of the front bench opposite that such a policy would neither be progressive nor fair, and we won't do it. Nor, Mr. Deputy Speaker, will we take advice on tax evasion and avoidance from those who in office were the friends of the avoiders and the evaders. When we came to office, city bankers boasted of paying lower tax rates than their cleaners. The rich routinely avoided stamp duty and foreigners paid no capital gains tax. We have changed all that, and it was this Prime Minister who put tackling international tax evasion at the top of the agenda at the G8. We will now legislate for the new common reporting standard we've got agreed around the world. Our new diverted profits tax is aimed at large multinationals who artificially shift their profits offshore. I can confirm that we will legislate for it next week and bring it into effect at the start of next month. I am also today amending corporation tax rules to prevent contrived loss arrangements and will no longer allow businesses to take account of foreign branches when reclaiming VAT on overheads, making the system simpler and fairer. We will close loopholes to make sure entrepreneurs' relief is only available to those selling genuine stakes in businesses. We will issue more accelerated payments notices to those who hold out from paying the tax that is owed. And we will stop employment intermediaries exploiting the tax system to reduce their own costs by clamping down on the agencies and umbrella companies who abuse tax reliefs on travel and subsistence, while we will protect those genuinely self-employed. Taken together, all the new measures against tax avoidance and evasion will raise £3.1 billion over the forecast period. I can also tell the House that we will conduct a review on the avoidance of inheritance tax through use of deeds of variation. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it will report by the autumn. We will seek a wide range of views. We look forward to drawing on the particular expertise of the Leader of the Opposition. Unless, that is, the Labour Party have executed its own deed of variation by then. Mr. Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend, the Chief Secretary, will tomorrow publish further details of our comprehensive plans for new criminal offences for tax evasion and new penalties for those professionals who assist them. Let the message go out: this country's tolerance for those who will not pay their fair share of taxes has come to an end. Mr. Deputy Speaker, because we seek a truly national recovery, today I also ask our banking sector to contribute more. Financial services are one of Britain's most important and successful industries, employing people in every corner of the country. We take steps to promote competition, back fintech, and encourage new business like global reinsurance. But as our banking sector becomes more profitable again, I believe they can make a bigger contribution to the repair of our public finances. I am today raising the rate of the bank levy to 0.21%. This will raise an additional £900 million a year. We will also stop banks from deducting from corporation tax the compensation they make to customers for products that they have missold, like PPI. Taken together, these new banking taxes will raise £5.3 billion across the forecast. The banks got support going into the crisis. Now they must support the whole country as we recover from the crisis. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in each budget, we have used the LIBOR fines paid by those who demonstrated the very worst of values to support those who represent the very best of British values. Today I can announce a further £75 million of help. Last week's service of commemoration reminded us all of the debt we owe to those brave British servicemen and women who served in Afghanistan. We will provide funds to the regimental charities of every regiment that fought in that conflict, and we will contribute funding to the permanent memorial to those who died there and died in Iraq. And in the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Britain, we will help to renovate the RAF Museum at Hendon, the Stowe Marys Airfield and the Biggin Hill Chapel Memorial, so future generations are reminded of the sacrifice of our airmen in all conflicts. We will provide £25 million to help our eldest veterans, including nuclear test veterans, and I congratulate my honourable friend for Basildon and Billericay for his campaign on their behalf. Many members on this side have also written to me asking for support for their local air ambulances. We've backed these brilliant local charities in the past, and we do so again today, with funds for new helicopters for the Essex and Herts, East Anglian, Welsh and Scottish air ambulances, and for the Lucy air ambulance that transports children requiring urgent care. And I pay tribute to many honourable friends, including those from Norwich North and Castle Point, for their campaigns. Our blood bike charities, Mr. Deputy Speaker, our blood bike charities also do an incredible job. MPs from across the House have written to me about this campaign. We respond to it and we are going to refund their VAT. We're also setting aside £1 million to help buy defibrillators for public places, including schools, and support training in their use to save more lives. Talking about people who save lives and who sometimes sacrifice their own life to do so, we will also correct the historic injustice to spouses of police officers, firefighters and members of the intelligence services who lose their lives on duty. And there's additional money today to support the fight against terrorism. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the £15 million church roof fund I set aside at the autumn statement to support church roof appeals has been heavily oversubscribed, so today we are more than trebling it. Apparently we're not the only people who want to fix the roof when the sun is shining. And every weekend, Mr. Deputy Speaker, thousands of people go out and raise sums for their local charities across Britain through sponsored events and high street collections. I am significantly extending the scheme I introduced that allows charities to claim automatic gift aid on these donations, increasing it from the first £5,000 they raise to £8,000. And that will benefit over 6,500 small charities. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, we could not let the 600th anniversary of Agincourt pass without commemoration. Now, the Battle of Agincourt is, of course, celebrated by Shakespeare as a victory secured by a band of brothers, which is sadly not an option available to the party opposite. But it is, Mr. Deputy Speaker, of course, when a strong leader defeated an ill-judged alliance between the champion of a united Europe and a renegade force of Scottish nationalists. So it is well worth spending £1 million to celebrate it. Mr. Deputy Speaker, our country does not rest on its past glories. Within just 15 years, we have the potential to overtake Germany and have the largest economy in Europe. 5 years ago, that would have seemed hopelessly unrealistic. Economic rescue was the limit of our horizons. Today, our goal is for Britain to become the most prosperous of any major economy in the world in the coming generation, and with that prosperity widely shared across the country. London is the global capital of the world, and we want it to grow stronger still. Today we confirm new investment in transport, regeneration from Brent Cross to Croydon, new powers for the Mayor over skills and planning, and new funding for the London Land Commission to help address the acute housing shortages in the capital. For we don't pull the rest of the country up by pulling London down. Instead, we will build on London's success by building the Northern Powerhouse. Now, working across party lines and in partnership with the councils of the North, We are this week publishing a comprehensive transport strategy for the North. We are funding the Health North initiative from the great teaching hospitals and universities there. We are promoting industries from chemicals in the North East to tech in the North West. And I can today confirm agreement with the West Yorkshire Combined Authority for a new city deal. Our agreement with Greater Manchester on an elected mayor is the most exciting development in civic leadership for a generation. With the devolution of power over skills, transport and now health budgets, I can announce today that we have reached provisional agreement to allow Greater Manchester to keep 100% of the additional growth in local business rates as we build up the Northern powerhouse. For where cities grow their economies through local initiatives, let me be clear, we will support and reward them. We are also going to offer the same 100% business rate deal to Cambridge and the surrounding councils, and my door is open to other areas that want to proceed as well. For our ambition for a truly national recovery is not limited to building a northern powerhouse. We back in full the long-term economic plans we have for every region. The Midlands is an engine of manufacturing growth, so we are today giving the go-ahead to the £60 million investment in the new Energy Research Accelerator that they have sought, and confirming the new National Energy Catapult will be in Birmingham. And we're going to back our brilliant automotive industry by investing £100 million to stay ahead in the race to driverless technology. And to encourage a new generation of low-emission vehicles, we will increase their company car tax more slowly than previously planned, while increasing other rates by 3% in 2019-20. We're also connecting up the South West with over £7 billion of transport investment, better roads, support for air links, and I can confirm today a new rail franchise which will bring new intercity express trains and greatly improved rail services to the South West. We are confirming the introduction of the first 20 housing zones that will keep Britain building, along with the extension of 8 enterprise zones across Britain, with new zones in Plymouth and in Blackpool too, and I congratulate my honourable friends from those areas for their campaigns. We're giving more power to Wales. We're working on a Cardiff City deal, and we're opening negotiations on the Swansea Bay Tidal Lagoon. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, the 7 crossings are a vital link for Wales. I can tell the House we will reduce the toll rates from 2018 and abolish the higher band for small vans and buses. It's a boost, Mr Deputy Speaker, for the drivers of white vans, and let me reassure the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party it will apply to pink vans too. The legislation devolving corporation tax to Northern Ireland passed the House of Lords yesterday. We now urge all parties to commit to the Stormont House Agreement, of which it is part. In Scotland, we will continue working on the historic devolution agreement, implementing the Glasgow City deal and opening negotiations on new city deals for Aberdeen and, of course, for Inverness. And while the falling oil price, Mr Deputy Speaker, is good news for families across the country, it brings with it challenges for hundreds of thousands whose jobs depend on the North Sea. Thanks to the field allowances we've introduced, we saw a record £15 billion of capital investment last year in the North Sea. But it's clear to me that the fall in the oil price poses a pressing danger to the future of our North Sea industry unless we take bold and immediate action. And I take that action today. First, I am introducing from the start of next month a single, simple and generous tax allowance to stimulate investment at all stages of the industry. Second, the government will invest in new seismic surveys in underexplored areas of the UK continental shelf. Third, from next year, the petroleum revenue tax will be cut from 50% to 35% to support continued production in older fields. Fourth, I am with immediate effect cutting the supplementary charge from 30% to 20% and backdating it to the beginning of January. It amounts to £1.3 billion of support for that vital industry in the North Sea. The OBR assess that it will boost expected North Sea oil production by 15% by the end of the decade. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, it goes without saying that an independent Scotland would never have been able to afford such a package of support. But it is one of the great strengths of our 300-old union that just as we pool our resources, so we share our challenges and find solutions together, for we are one united kingdom. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we back oil and gas, and we back our heavy industry too, like steel and paper mills. I've listened to the engineering employers, and I will bring forward to this autumn part of our compensation for energy-intensive plants. But since we aim to be the most prosperous major economy in the coming generation, then we must support the latest insurgent industries too. So we take steps to put Britain at the forefront of the online sharing economy, and our creative industries are already a huge contributor to the British economy. We back them again today. We make our TV and film tax credits more generous. We expand our support for the video games industry, and we launch our new tax credit for orchestras. Britain is a cultural centre of the world, and with these tax changes, I'm determined we will stay that way. And in the week after Cheltenham, we support the British racing industry by introducing a new horse race betting right. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, local newspapers are a vital part of community life, but they have had a very tough time in recent years. Today we announce a consultation on how we can provide them too with tax support. Future economic success depends on future scientific success. So we'll add to the financial support I announced at the autumn statement for postgraduates, with new support for PhDs and research-based master's degrees. We're also committing almost £140 million to world-class research across the UK into the infrastructure and cities of the future. And I can announce today that our national research institutes get new budget freedoms. And we'll also, Mr. Deputy Speaker, invest in what is known as the Internet of Things. This is the next stage of the information revolution, connecting up everything from urban transport to medical devices to household appliances. So should, to use a completely ridiculous example, someone have two kitchens, they'll be able to control both fridges from the same mobile phone. Mr. Deputy Speaker, all these industries depend on fast broadband. We've transformed the digital infrastructure of Britain over the last 5 years. Over 80% of the population have access to super-fast broadband, and there are 6 million customers of 4G that our auction made possible. Today we set out a comprehensive strategy so we stay ahead. We'll use up to £600 million to clear new spectrum bands for further auction, so we improve mobile phone networks. We'll test the latest satellite technology so we reach the remotest communities. We'll provide funding for Wi-Fi in our public libraries and expand broadband vouchers to many more cities, so no one is excluded. And we are committing today to a new national ambition to bring ultra-fast broadband of at least 100 megabits per second to nearly all the homes in the country, so that Britain is out in front. Mr. Deputy Speaker, you can't create jobs without successful businesses. And as well as the right infrastructure, businesses also need low competitive taxes. In 2 weeks' time, we will cut corporation tax to 20%, one of the lowest rates of any major economy in the world. Now, there are those here who are committed to putting the rate of corporation tax up. They should know that this would be the first increase in this tax rate since 1973, and a job-destroying and retrograde step for this country to take. And rather than increasing the jobs tax, as some propose, we are going to go on cutting it. This April, we will abolish national insurance for employing under 21s. Next April, we will abolish it for employing a young apprentice. And I can confirm today that 1 million small businesses have now claimed our new employment allowance. From this April, we're also extending our small business rate relief and our help for the high street. But in my view, the current system of business rates has not kept pace with the needs of a modern economy and changes to our town centre. It needs far-reaching reform. Businesses large and small have asked for a major review of this tax, and this week that is what we've agreed to do. The boost I provided to annual investment allowances comes to an end at the end of the year. A better time to address this is in the autumn statement. However, I'm clear from my conversations with business groups that a reduction to £25,000 would not be remotely acceptable, and so it will be set at a much more generous rate. And today I'm announcing changes to the enterprise investment schemes and the venture capital trusts to ensure they are compliant with the latest state aid rules and increasing support to high-growth companies. Mr. Deputy Speaker, businesses like people want their taxes to be low. They also want them to be simple to pay. We set up the Office of Tax Simplification at the start of this Parliament, and I want to thank Michael Jack and John Whiting for the fantastic job that they have done to support 5 million people who are self-employed and to make their tax affairs simpler. In the next Parliament, we will abolish Class 2 national insurance contributions for the self-employed entirely. And today we can bring simpler taxes to many more. 12 million people and small businesses are forced to complete a self-assessment tax return every year. It is complex, it is costly and time-consuming. So today I am announcing this. We will abolish the annual tax return altogether. Millions of individuals will have the information the revenue needs automatically uploaded into new digital tax accounts. A minority with the most complex tax affairs will be able to manage their account online. Businesses will feel like they're paying a simple single business tax. And again, for most, the information needed will be automatically received. A revolutionary simplification of tax collection starting next year, because on this side of the House, we believe people should be working for themselves, not working for the tax man. Tax really doesn't have to be taxing, and this spells the death of the annual tax return. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we want to help families with simpler taxes and with lower taxes too. So let me turn now to duties. I have no changes to make to the duties on tobacco and gaming already announced. Last year, thanks to the persistent campaigning of my honourable friends for Burton and for Keighley and Ilkley, I cut beer duty for the second year in a row, and the industry estimates that it helped create 16,000 jobs. Today, I am cutting beer duty for the third year in a row and taking another penny off a pint. I am also cutting cider duty by 2% to support our producers in the West Country and elsewhere, and to back one of the UK's biggest exports, the duty on Scotch whisky and other spirits will be cut by 2% as well. Wine duty will be frozen. More pubs saved, jobs created, families supported, and a penny off a pint for the third year in a row. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I also want to help families with the cost of filling up a car. It is a cost that bears heavily on small businesses too. The last government's plans for a fuel duty escalator meant taxes would rise above inflation every year. But I want to make sure that the falling oil price is passed on at the pumps. So I am today cancelling the fuel duty increase scheduled for September. Petrol frozen again. It's the longest duty freeze in over 20 years. It saves a family around £10 every time they fill up their car. That's £10 off a tank with the Tories. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we believe that work should pay and families should keep more of the money they earn. When we came to office, the personal tax-free allowance stood at just £6,500. We set ourselves the goal, even in difficult times, of raising that allowance to £10,000 by the end of the Parliament. And we have more than delivered on that promise. In 2 weeks' time, it will reach £10,600, and that is a huge boost to the incomes of working people, and one of the reasons we have a record number of people in work. Today, I can announce that we go further. The personal tax-free allowance will rise to £10,800 next year, and then to £11,000 the year after. That's £11,000 you can earn before paying any income tax at all. It means the typical working taxpayer will be over £900 a year better off. It's a tax cut for 27 million people. And it means we've taken almost 4 million of the lowest paid out of income tax altogether. And because we pass on the full gains of this policy, I can make this announcement today. For the first time in 7 years, the threshold at which people pay the higher rate will rise not just with inflation, but above inflation. It will rise from $42,385 this year to $43,300 by 2017-18. So an £11,000 personal allowance, an above-inflation increase in the higher rate, delivered by a coalition government and a Conservative Chancellor, a down payment on our commitment to raise the personal allowance to £12,500, raise the higher rate threshold to £50,000, an economic plan that is working for you. And in this budget, the rate of the new transferable tax allowance for married couples will rise to £1,100 too. That's the allowance coming in just 2 weeks' time to help over 4 million couples, help that they would take away, but we on this side are proud to provide. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this budget takes another step to move Britain from a country built on debt to a country built on savings and investment. Last year, I unlocked pensions with freedom for millions of savers, but there is more to do to create a savings culture. Today, I announce 4 major new steps in our saving revolution. They are based on the principles that cutting taxes increases the return on savings and that people should have freedom to choose how they use their own savings. So first, we will give 5 million pensioners access to their annuity. For many, an annuity is the right product, but for some it makes sense to access their annuity now, so we're changing the law to make that possible. From next year, the punitive tax charge of at least 55% will be abolished. Tax will be applied only at the marginal rate, and we'll consult to ensure pensioners get the right guidance and advice, so freedom for 5 million people with an annuity. Second, we will introduce a radically more flexible ISA. In 2 weeks' time, the changes I've already made mean that people will be able to put £15,240 into an ISA. But if you take that money out, you lose your tax-free entitlement, and so you can't put it back in. This restricts what people can do with their own savings, but I believe people should be trusted with their own hard-earned money. With the fully flexible ISA, people will have complete freedom to take money out and put it back in later in the year without losing any of their tax-free entitlement. It will be available from this autumn, and we'll also expand the range of investments that are eligible. Third, we're going to take 2 of our most successful policies and combine them to create a brand new Help to Buy ISA. And we do it to tackle 2 of the biggest challenges facing first-time buyers: the low interest rates when you build up your savings and the high deposits required by the banks. The Help to Buy ISA for first-time buyers works like this. For every £200 you save for your deposit, the government will top it up with £50 more. It's as simple as this. We'll work hand in hand to help you buy your first home. This is a budget that works for you. A 10% deposit on the average first home costs £15,000. So if you put in up to £12,000, we'll put in £3,000 more. A 25% top-up is equivalent to saving for a deposit from your pre-tax income. It's effectively a tax cut for first-time buyers, and we'll work with industry so it's ready for this autumn, and we'll make sure you can start saving for it right now. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, access for pensioners to their annuities, a new flexible ISA, backing home ownership with a first-time buyer bonus, and one other reform. Today, I introduce a new personal savings allowance that will take 95% of taxpayers out of savings tax altogether. From April next year, the first £1,000 of the interest you earn on all of your savings will be completely tax-free. To ensure higher-rate taxpayers enjoy the same benefits but no more, their allowance will be set at £500. People have already paid tax once on their money when they earned it. They shouldn't have to pay tax a second time when they save it. With our new personal savings allowance, 17 million people will see the tax on their savings not just cut, but abolished altogether. An entire system of tax collection can be scrapped. At a stroke, we create tax-free banking for almost the entire population, and we build the economy on savings and not on debt. Mr. Deputy Speaker, 5 years ago, I had to present to this House an emergency budget. Today, I present the budget of an economy stronger in every way from the one we inherited. The budget of an economy taking another big step from austerity to prosperity. We cut the deficit and confidence is returning. We limited spending, made work pay, backed business and growth is returning. We gave people control over their savings and helped people own their own homes, and optimism is returning. We have provided clear, decisive economic leadership, and from the depths, Britain is returning. The share of national income taken up by debt falling, the deficit down, growth up, jobs up, living standards on the rise, Britain on the rise. This is the budget for Britain, the comeback country.
It might help if I put the question, or else there will be no budget. Under the Standing Order number 51, the first motion entitled Provisional Collection of Taxes must be decided without debate. Will the Chancellor of the Exchequer please move formally?
To move.
The question is that pursuant to Section 5 of the Provisional Collection of Taxes Act 1968, provisional statutory effect shall be given to the following motions. Alcoholic liquor duties rates motion number 27. Tobacco products duty rates motion number 28. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. I shall now call upon the Chancellor of the Exchequer to move motion entitled Amendment of the Law, and it is on the motion that the debate will take place today and on succeeding days. The questions on this motion and on the remaining motions will be put at the end of the budget debate on Monday, the 26th of March. Will the Chancellor please move the amendment of the law motion? Minister, move forward. The question is that the expedient to amend the law with respect to the national debt and the public revenue and to make further provision in connection with the finance. 2. This resolution does not extend to the making of any amendment with respect to value-added tax so as to provide A. For zero rating or exempting a supply of acquisition or importation. B. The refunding an amount of tax. C. For any relief other than the relief that, so far as it is applicable to goods, applies to goods of every description, and so far as applicable to services and applies to services of every description. I now call the Leader of the Opposition, the Right Honourable Edward Miliband.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, never has the gap between the Chancellor's rhetoric and the reality of people's lives been greater than it was today. This is a budget people won't believe from a government that's not on their side because of their record, because of their instincts, because of their plans for the future, and because of a budget, most extraordinarily, that had no mention of investment in our National Health Service and our vital public services. It's a budget people won't believe from a government they don't trust. And this Chancellor has failed the working families of Britain. For the first time since the 1920s, people are earning less at the end of a government than they were at the beginning. People...
Order. Quite rightly, I expected the Chancellor to be heard. And I certainly expect the same courtesy to be given to the Leader of the Opposition, Ed Miliband.
People are £1,600 a year worse off. The next generation has seen wages plummet and tuition fees treble. They've built fewer homes than at any time for nearly 100 years. And it's certainly not, Mr. Deputy Speaker, a truly national recovery when there are more zero-hours contracts than the population of Glasgow, Leeds and Cardiff combined. That is the reality of the lives of working people. These are the facts. These are the inconvenient truths of his record. It's a recovery for the few from a government of the few. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, he chose to make a number of references. He chose to make a number of references to me today. let me just tell him, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we're not going to take lessons on fairness from the Trust Fund Chancellor and the Bullingdon Club Prime Minister. And not for the first time, this is a budget from this Chancellor that simply won't be believed. We support the change on the personal allowance, but on tax, he gives with one hand and he takes far more away with the other. Mr. Deputy Speaker, nobody believes this Chancellor when he says he's going to cut their taxes, because that's not what's happened. Not only are wages down by £1,600, but taxes are up. 24 tax rises. Families worse off as a result of his measures, on average, by £1,127 a year, the equivalent of 8 pence on the basic rate of income tax. That is the reality behind a budget that cannot be believed. And everyone knows what's coming if they were to get back: another rise in VAT. The tax the Tories love to raise. And of course, Mr. Deputy Speaker, in the finest Tory tradition, what's the lesson? Deny it before an election and then jack up VAT afterwards. Now on living standards. On living standards, which the Chancellor made much of in his speech. The Chancellor knows that on the official measure from the ONS, people are clearly worse off under him. So he's had a bright idea, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to invent a new measure of living standards to prove that, in fact, what people know in their wallets and their pockets somehow isn't true. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, people don't need a new measure which pretends they're better off. They need a new government to make them better off. That's the reality behind a budget that can't be believed. Now, what about low pay? Again, he talked about it in his speech, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Chancellor poses today as the friend of the low-paid. I mean, you couldn't make it up, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
There's a little too much noise coming in the back row. Mr. Shelbrooke, just because you move positions doesn't mean to say I do not see you. The last thing I need from you is to explode. It will neither be good for you nor the chamber. Miliband.
I'm bound to ask, Mr. Deputy Speaker, whatever did happen to the promise of a £7 minimum wage this year? But the Chancellor made much of it 18 months ago. He was going to have a £7 minimum wage, and he has broken that promise. And the idea of this Chancellor of the Exchequer boasting about a 20p rise in the minimum wage, expecting low-paid workers to be grateful, that is the reality behind a budget that cannot be believed. And of course, Mr. Deputy Speaker, he doesn't just now claim to be a friend of the low-paid. He claims to be a friend of the North.
Order. I'm not going to keep saying that I want to hear the Leader of the Opposition. I expect everybody to hear the Leader of the Opposition.
Now, on the specifics, we're pleased he's adopted our policy of 100% business rates, councils being able to keep it. But I've got to ask, why doesn't he do it for every council right across the country? Why is he just doing one? And let's talk about, he's done two, says the Chief Secretary, helpfully there. I mean, isn't it great? The Liberal Democrats locked in the boot of the Conservative Party. Now let's talk about what he's done to the north of England. Let's really test him out on whether he's a friend of the north. 75% bigger cuts to local government budgets in the north than the rest of the country. In the northwest, 400,000 working families have seen their tax credits cut. That's more than any other region. In the northeast, he's spending £1 on transport for every £25 he spends in London. Now he spent time in his speech praising northern councils. Well, let's see what the northern councils have to say about him. Because he talked about Leeds. This is what the leader of Leeds has said. The Chancellor, Labour, yeah, but he was praising them in his statement. Let's see what they have to say. He says, the Chancellor fails to deliver the devolution we need. This government is no friend of the North. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, Mr. Deputy Speaker, Mr. Deputy Speaker, for the interest.
Order. Seriously, it's getting out of hand. It doesn't. Just a moment. Just a moment. You can shout all day. I've already looked at Mr. Hands. He may hide behind Sir Tony, but we all know where he is. His voice may carry, but I know where he's sat. So much as Sir Tony may move, I recognise it. So I don't need any more help. All I will say to the government benches is, let us listen, let's get to the end. Because as I said earlier, we have our constituents who wants to hear what both sides wish to say. Ed Miliband.
And this, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is what Joe Anderson, the Mayor of Liverpool, said. The Chancellor has bludgeoned Liverpool. We've had 58% of our funding taken away. Even Dick Turpin had the decency to wear a mask when he robbed people. That's what he thinks of the Chancellor. Now they say, why don't I quote Conservative leaders? Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, for the interest of balance, I would have liked to quote a Conservative leader of a northern city, but there aren't any. And with these two in charge, there never will be. Now, on tax avoidance, the gap, he talked about tax avoidance in his statement, but the gap between what is owed and what is collected is up, not down. And no wonder. He hasn't acted on tax havens, despite the Prime Minister's promises. He didn't act on HSBC. In fact, he appointed the chairman as a minister. And what about hedge funds, Mr. Deputy Speaker? Strangely absent from the Chancellor's statement. Where was the action on stamp duty avoidance? It's costing well over £1 billion a year. Of course, they can't act on hedge funds because they bankroll the Tory party. He can't act because they own him lock, stock and barrel. And the Conservative Party is now just the political wing of the tax avoidance industry. But of course, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the biggest sleight of hand of all, is on the deficit. Because I think the Chancellor was doing a bit of rewriting of history today. 5 years ago, what did the Prime Minister say? He said, we will balance the books in 5 years. No ifs, no buts, no maybes, just like the immigration pledge. Now today the Chancellor comes along to boast that he's halved the deficit. But that's not what the Prime Minister used to say about halving the deficit. He said it would be completely inadequate. So let me get this straight, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's gone from completely inadequate to a great triumph. I don't think that's going to wash with people, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The only thing long-term about his plan is it will take nearly twice as long to balance the books. And it can't be believed, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Mr. Ellis. I've said earlier, please, a little more control. Ed Miliband.
And it can't be believed, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because we've heard it all before. 5 years of promising a recovery for all, 5 years of delivering a recovery for the few. And now he asks us to believe it all over again. And of course, the most unbelievable thing of all is their claim, we're all in it together. They say yes to the bedroom tax, no to the mansion tax. Food banks on the rise, bank bonuses in their billions. Taxes up for working families, taxes cut for millionaires. The best thing you can say about the Chancellor and the Prime Minister is that when the removal vans turn up, they will be in it together. And his failure, and Mr. Deputy Speaker, his failure on living standards, on tax, on the deficit, are actually all linked. It's because our economy is too unproductive, too unbalanced, and too insecure. There are some things that he didn't mention in his statement today. Our productivity gap with the rest of the G7 is now the worst for a quarter of a century, on his watch. He talked again today about the rebalancing, but the rebalancing he promised hasn't happened. The Chancellor's target for exports is set to be missed by over £300 billion. And on this budget's figures, he's actually overseen the slowest recovery for 100 years. That is the reality behind the budget that cannot be believed. And for all of the window dressing today, they can't tackle insecurity at work because they think that's how we compete. They can't make work pay because they believe low pay is the way that we succeed. And they can't build an economy for working families because they think wealth flows from the top. Mr. Deputy Speaker, not for the first time, the chairman of the Conservative Party perfectly summed up Tory philosophy in his celebrated handbook, Stinking Rich 3. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm not sure what happened to Stinking Rich 1 and 2. Now the Chancellor announced a number of measures on savings, and I think it's very, very important that we look at the detail of these changes. We do want people to have more flexibility, including on annuities. I do say to the Chancellor, he talked about advice in the annuity market. It's incredibly important that advice happens quickly, because we've got rip-off merchants ready to pounce. We know it's happened before. We know it's happened.
Mr. Williamson, you're this side of Mr. Baldry. I see you very easily. Thank you. Miliband.
Well, but Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is a very serious issue because we know it has happened before. It happened in the 1980s, a dreadful mis-selling scandal, and the Chancellor needs to get proper regulation in place on these issues. But we will look at the changes that he has talked about. Now, the glaring omission from this budget statement, Mr. Deputy Speaker, was the National Health Service and public spending. I mean, it was a completely extraordinary admission. Where was that discussion of the National Health Service and investment in public services? I think it's time, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we looked at the reality of this government's spending plans, because this is the budget that can't be believed. And he doesn't want you to know it, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but he had an extreme spending plan yesterday, and he has an extreme spending plan today. It's here in the Red Book, in black and white, on page 69. It shows his plan for extreme cuts in the next Parliament. Table 2.4 of the Red Book shows he's trying to hide big cuts between 2016 and 2018. So let me tell the House what the Chancellor tried to hide. His plans are for at least as many cuts in the next Parliament as this one. And actually, the pace of cuts in the next few years is actually faster than the cuts in the last few years. So here's the thing. Here's the thing, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I think it's very important the country knows this. He came along today to try and suggest that the pain was over. But if they get back, it isn't. Their failure on the deficit means they are planning massive cuts in the next Parliament, billions of pounds of cuts in the next Parliament. And you might ask, Mr. Deputy Speaker, what's the evidence for it? There's a lot of evidence. Let's start with what the Prime Minister said in his education speech. The Prime Minister came along in his education speech and he said they were going to cut the early years, they were going to cut schools, they were going to cut colleges, cuts in education spending. Mr. Deputy Speaker, shortchanging education today means we cannot build a recovery for all tomorrow. And it's most worrying of all on the National Health Service. Because, you see, because of these huge cuts that they've announced, and all of the members opposite will have to go and justify this to their constituents, or because of the massive cuts they've announced, it means there'll be colossal cuts planned, and I emphasise planned, in defence, in policing, in local government. But they won't be able to deliver those cuts, so they'll end up cutting the National Health Service. That is the secret plan that dare not speak its name today. And he didn't tell us. You can tell they're really worried about it, Mr. Deputy Speaker. They're worried about it. And the Chancellor didn't tell us that his plans also continue massive cuts to social care. Yes.
I think the Defence Minister and myself don't want to fall out. If there's some letters to sign on her desk, it might be better if she can't keep quiet. Ed Miliband.
And they didn't tell us that, of course, their plans involve massive cuts to social care as well. We've already in this Parliament seen hundreds of thousands fewer elderly people being cared for. And what is the lesson, Mr. Deputy Speaker? If you devastate social care, you betray the elderly and you pile unsustainable pressure on our National Health Service. And these two are coming along and promising more of the same. That's why they can't be trusted on the National Health Service. Mr. Deputy Speaker, building a truly national recovery needs a new government. We won't sit by while people are on 0 hours contracts month after month, year after year. Instead, we will legislate for a new principle that if you do regular hours, you get a regular contract. He talked about the minimum wage in his statement. Let's talk about what's happened on the minimum wage. Let's talk about what's happened on the minimum wage.
Mr. Williamson, be helpful to the Chamber, or I will be unhelpful to you, and I don't want to get to that stage. Right on Ed Miliband.
The minimum wage has gone up by just 70 pence in this Parliament. A Labour government will raise it by more than double that to a minimum wage of more than £8 an hour. And we will have a real industrial policy. There was the Chancellor has been a particularly malign influence in this government on climate change, because the Prime Minister used to claim that he believed in climate change. I mean, it is extraordinary, I have to say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, even by his standards, to put a wind turbine on your roof and then want a moratorium on wind turbines. I know he's a stranger to consistency, but even by his standards, that's going some. But we will end the dabbling with climate change denial, have a proper green investment bank. And yes, Mr. Deputy Speaker, a Labour government will support the young, not make them pay the price of hard times. We'll ensure that every major government contract will guarantee apprenticeships. And yes, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we will cut tuition fees to £6,000 to reduce the burden of debt on young people. And let the Deputy Prime Minister defend his broken promises on the doorstep. And all of this will be underpinned by a balanced plan that cuts the deficit every year, protects education and health, and has fairer taxes. And Mr. Speaker, yeah, I do believe in a progressive tax system, reversing his millionaires' tax cut, a mansion tax to fund the NHS, and abolishing the vindictive, unfair bedroom tax that he imposed. That is what a Labour budget would do from a Labour government that knows Britain only succeeds when working families succeed. And now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we know the choice at the election. We've seen 5 years of falling living standards, young people paying the price of hard times, and NHS going backwards. This budget didn't solve the problems facing working families, it confirmed them. Britain needs a better plan, a plan for working families. Britain needs a Labour government.